Hello, dear friends from the English-speaking countries, especially from African English-speaking countries. Usually I make my videos in French as my videos are mainly targeting the public here in Corsica, in France, and in French-speaking countries. But 2 days ago, I prepared a video and a radio podcast in reaction to the recent events taking place in Niger and Gabon, and in Africa as a whole. So I decided to repeat what I was saying during that program, to repeat it in English, because I thought that some people in English-speaking countries, especially in Africa, would be interested in hearing what I had to say, and my views, which are not exactly what I would call mainstream views, because of my particular background. So here is what I was saying in French a few days ago about the situation in Gabon, in Niger, and other countries. I was starting by explaining my interest in the African continent, which started during the 70s. By then I was spending my pocket money, I was still very young, in buying magazines such as Jeune Afrique or Africasie, which played a significant role in opening my mind to developing countries' issues. One of my uncles was working by then for a major French oil company called ELF. His career brought him to places such as Port-Gentil in Gabon, Pointe-Noire in Congo-Brazzaville, and even on offshore platforms in Angola. His stories during each of his home leaves completed usefully my readings, and as an adolescent, I was dreaming of spending holidays in Port-Gentil or in Pointe-Noire. It never happened, but I compensated those missed opportunities with my 24-year career in Africa between 1989 and 2013. Nevertheless, I didn't follow my uncle's example, as I never worked for any oil company or for any big company for that matter. Instead, I followed my own path. In the beginning of the 80s, that my own path was humanitarian, and it started in Southeast Asia. But before that, one day I remember when my uncle came back from Gabon, he brought me a gift from there. It was what we call in French a 45 tours, musical single entitled Albert Bernard Bongo, c'est le président qu'il nous faut, or in English, Albert Bernard Bongo is the president we need. On the cover, there was a beautiful color picture showing a youthful president with a heavy golden bracelet on his wrist. I still remember the entertaining lyrics, even if I am sad to have lost that single, which I would have very much loved to listen again, especially during the past few days. If I'm talking a lot about my Africanist youth, it is because I would like to explain that my African vision is not based on the current troubles taking place in Niger or in Gabon. No, my vision takes its roots in the 70s. And I have also integrated in my analysis all the evolutions that I closely followed up during the past 50 years. For example, I clearly remember what my uncle told me about what he experienced in Congo-Brazzaville when Major Marian Ngouabi, the then Marxist military leader of that country, was assassinated in a helicopter crash in 1977, and all the ensuing troubles which occurred in that country until 1979, when Denis Sassou Nguesso brought back order. 44 years later, in fact, no, if I'm not mistaken, it should have, 44 years later, 1979 up to 2023, 44 years later, the same man is still in power. But I mainly remember that by then, the African continent was dominated by two kinds of colors. Those of the military khaki uniforms and those of the bright African dresses printed to glorify the party or the president. By then, there was no any democratic country in Africa, with the notable exception of Botswana, which has always been a democratic country ever since becoming independent. In the southern part of the continent, South Africa and Rhodesia were still ruled by minorities of European origin. In the northern part, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt were submitted to one-party systems. In between, the whole of sub-Saharan Africa was either made of military dictatorships or civilian dictatorships under the one-party system. It's only from 1976 that Senegal, under the leadership of its poet-president, Léopold Sédar Senghor, started introducing multipartism, becoming the first country in Francophone Africa to do so. The military coups epidemics started a few years after the African independences of the early 60s. The first one took place in Togo, initiated by a former French army sergeant, Gnassingbé Eyadema, who ruled the country until his death in 2005. Since then, his son has been in power. Niger, Mali, Mauritania, the Sudan, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana, Chad, the Central African Republic, Uganda, Somalia, Ethiopia, Upper Volta, Dahomey, Rwanda, Burundi, both Congos, Equatorial Guinea, the Gambia, Madagascar, Comoros, all those countries have had one or several military putschs during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Even peaceful Ivory Coast, once branded as the success story of French-speaking Africa, had a military coup. That was in 1999. And it had terrible consequences for that country, leading to a war which split it into two halves for several years, north and south. All those pronunciamientos were sometimes just palace revolutions, one officer replacing another, as it happened in Niger, Mauritania, or in the Sudan, or even in Burundi, where the three colonels who succeeded each other were all Tutsis originating from the same commune in the south of the country. But sometimes military coups took a nasty turn with bloody purges and summary public executions, like in Liberia, Ghana, or Uganda. Often, the military regimes ended in endless civil wars, which destroyed the infrastructures and the economy of several countries and caused tens of thousands deaths, if not hundreds of thousands deaths, like in Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, Liberia, or Sierra Leone. It happened that military coups opened the affected countries to invasions by hordes of jihadists, like in Mali. As for the countries ruled by one-party systems, their presidents always tried to remain in power forever, and sometimes even groomed their sons to eventually take over. This type of scenario has become quite frequent in Africa. It was implemented in Gabon and Togo, and in Egypt, President Mubarak tried to do the same, but he failed, and he lost power. In Uganda, President Museveni, who seized power by force in 1986, is currently, as I'm talking, preparing the ground for his son. In Chad, the brutal death of Idriss Déby was immediately followed by a military coup which allowed the dictator's son to take over. This was done with France's implicit support. President Macron even went to N'Djamena to attend Idriss Déby's funerals, thereby giving a certain degree of legitimacy to the power of the son. Africa is a continent where the population is very young. Few Africans remember the colonial rule or have memories of the military coups of the 70s. That's why I tend to be indulgent with those signposts carriers who loudly express their enthusiasm in the streets of Niamey or Libreville, cheering the new military leaders. None of those demonstrators actually remember the disasters caused by previous putschs, especially in Niger, where so many military coups took place in the past. They don't know that military officers never have any particular competence to rule a country. I still have in mind the overjoyed crowds of Ugandans cheering their new military leader in 1971. His name was Idi Amin. Nowhere in Africa or in the rest of the world did military regimes bring positive changes. Even in Ghana, even in Upper Volta, renamed Burkina Faso, military takeovers sooner or later caused countless tragedies. I was in Africa when the continent was swept by the wind of multipartism in the 90s. I was in Zambia, I was in Malawi, as that wind was blowing and sweeping away one-party regimes, which nobody had imagined that they would collapse so quickly. I witnessed street demonstrations being harshly repressed. I witnessed the courage of all those people facing the live bullets being fired by police. Later, I saw crowds rejoicing, forgetting that what they were now burning was what they were forced to adore for so long. My local colleagues, who a few weeks earlier were so afraid of expressing themselves, became so talkative about all the evils of the previous regime, or about their sometimes unrealistic dreams in a future which could only be better according to them. What I witnessed by then, the Niamey or Libreville demonstrators were too young to remember it, or they were not even born when all those events took place. I also experienced the disillusions which followed rapidly the democratic changes. We cannot eat democracy was what I was often told in Malawi or in Uganda. Often, the governments brought to power through the ballot box produced increased corruption and the emergence of a new rich elite, increased gaps between the rich and the poor, increased unemployment rates, and as a consequence, increased poverty. I have often heard people saying that life was better before, during the time of the old dictator, that under his rule there was law and order, at least, security, and that it was easier to get a job. It is also true that most human beings always think that it was better before, when they were younger. But there was undoubtedly some truth in what people were telling me. Those Africans nostalgic of the past. I have even heard old people with white hair telling me that it was better during the colonial time. For all those reasons, because of all those sweet and sour memories, I don't give too much credit to the street demonstrators, be it in Niamey or in Libreville. To end this talk, I'd like to say a few words about Gabon, a country very familiar to me, thanks to my uncle, even if I never set foot there. First, a little bit of history. Who remembers the first Gabonese military coup? It took place on the 17th of February 1964. On that day, at 5 a.m., President Léon Mba and most of the government ministers were arrested by 150 soldiers, led by Lieutenants Jacques Mombo and Valère Essonné, who didn't have to fire a single shot. In a radio broadcast, they urged the population to remain quiet, and they committed themselves to pursue the same pro-French foreign policy. A provisional government was set up, and Jean-Hilaire Obame, an MP who was the main opponent to President Mba, was appointed as the new president of the country. President Mba was sent to Lambaréné, 250 kilometers from Libreville, where he was kept under house arrest. The news of the military takeover was received with indifference by the population, and it didn't meet any armed resistance. But the former president's chief of cabinet, a man called Albert Bernard Bongo, managed to inform the French president, Charles de Gaulle, about the developments in Gabon. De Gaulle's reaction was swift. After taking the decision to restore the legitimate power in accordance with a treaty signed by the two countries in 1960, when Gabon became independent, he ordered the airlifting of two paratroopers companies to Libreville. On the 19th of February, the French military stormed Camp Baraka, which was used as the rebel headquarters. The French military lost one man, while two others were wounded. 2 days later, President Mba was freed and taken back to the presidential palace in Libreville. After that military coup, which lasted 2 days only, President Léon Mba sought revenge and sent more than 150 of his opponents to prison. Jean-Hilaire Obame, the MP who had been appointed as president by the mutineers, was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. He was eventually released in 1972. After those events, President Mba spent the rest of his life at the presidential palace, protected by French soldiers. He died of cancer 3 years later, on the 20th of November 1967. I've just mentioned the role played by his chief of cabinet, Albert Bernard Bongo, during the military coup. When the president died, Bongo was in Paris. It was therefore inside the Gabonese embassy in that city that he was sworn in as the new president of the Republic of Gabon. President Bongo soon founded the PDG, or Democratic Party of Gabon, which became the only authorized party of Gabon under the one-party system. Albert Bernard later became Omar Abdel, and he remained in power until his death in a Barcelona hospital in 2009. Struggles within the Bongo family led to the appointment as presidential candidate of Omar Abdel Bongo's son, Ali. His subsequent election crushed the hopes of Bongo's elder daughter, Pascaline, who had been a very influential person under her father. She had even been his chief of cabinet and later his minister of foreign affairs. In my regular videos and radio programs in French, I often denounce what I call the African dinosaurs and the presidential dynasties. Gabon has been ruled by one of those African dinosaurs from 1967 to 2009, and the country also had a dynastic regime since Ali Bongo replaced his late father. I have also regularly attacked the high degree of corruption within the Bongo regime. I wrote about the Bien Malaki saga, that is, luxury mansions and vehicles and other luxury items bought by the Bongo family in France and elsewhere. This practice is a common one in the region, especially in two of Gabon's neighbors, Equatorial Guinea and its dictator Teodoro Obiang-Nguema, who seized power in 1979 after having executed his uncle, and Congo-Brazzaville and its strongman Denis Sassou Nguesso, who also took power in 1979. The Bongos, the Obiang-Nguemas and the Sassou Nguessos were all spending public money or oil money to acquire properties in Europe, in America and elsewhere. In addition, the name of Ali Bongo was mentioned in the Pandora Papers, which revealed that he had been hiding huge amounts of money in fiscal havens. Last but not least, Ali Bongo used massive electoral fraud to be elected and re-elected. I therefore didn't lament when, on the 30th of August, I heard the news that he had been overthrown by a military coup. Immediately after the presidential election results had been announced. According to those official results, Ali Bongo got 64.27% of the votes. Rumors that the elections had been fraudulent were widespread, and it was believed that the opposition candidate had actually won, despite the fact that the official results were giving him 30.77% of the votes only. But I didn't rejoice, as for me, a military coup is never good news. And in this particular case, I knew that the coup leader, General Brice Oligui Nguema, chief of the Republican Guard, that is the presidential guard, was a man belonging to the Bongo system, from which he was a beneficiary. He is even a Bongo family member, since his mother was a cousin of the late Omar Abdel Bongo. Even if one of his first decisions was to arrest high-ranking officials suspected of malversations, such as Nourdine Bongo Valentin, one of Ali Bongo's sons, General Brice Oligui Nguema himself had been accused of corruption in the past. It is said that between 2015 and 2018, he purchased 3 properties in Washington, D.C.'s suburbs, and that he paid the required amount, more than $1 million in cash. The Gabonese who express their happiness on the streets of Libreville and Port-Gentil should not have high expectations, as I don't think the new leader will change the corrupt system which has been in place in Gabon for so long. If General Brice Oligui Nguema had really wanted to be credible, instead of deciding to have a swearing-in ceremony on the 4th of September, he should have announced a ballot recount regarding the presidential elections of the 26th of August, and once it was done, he should have handed over the presidential palace keys to the real winner. The fact that he didn't do it is a clear sign that he intends to remain in power and that the corruption system will remain in place at the highest level of the state. It is sad because Gabon is potentially a very rich country thanks to its oil and precious wood exports. But it is also a country where the divide is huge between the happy few and the majority of the population living in poverty and facing mass unemployment. It is to be noted that the entire diplomatic corps was present during the swearing-in ceremony on the 4th of September. What a contrast with what happened in Niger after the military coup of the 26th of July. The international community has still not recognized the new regime there. France, which was so close to the Bongo regime, father and son, seems to have validated the military coup and to have dropped the son. Truly, Ali's re-election was arguable, while in Niger, the military have overthrown a democratically elected president whose legitimacy was not disputed. As can be understood, both situations in Gabon and in Niger are extremely different, and Paris' soft approach to the situation in Gabon and its rigid attitude towards the Niger putschists can therefore be easily understood. Nevertheless, we can only hope that France's kindness will not last too long and that everything will be done to convince General Oligui Nguema to hand over power to a democratically elected president as soon as possible. Any other scenario would prove to the rest of the world and to Africa as a whole that Paris is agreeing to an extension of the Bongo system even without Bongo, just like in Chad, the Déby system got a new lifespan without Idriss Déby. Moreover, other long-lasting regimes in neighboring countries might also collapse in the near future. I am particularly thinking of Cameroon, a country ruled by Paul Biya 90-year-old, in power for the past 40 years. I am also thinking of Congo-Brazzaville, of course. If such events were to take place in Cameroon and Congo-Brazzaville, it is to be hoped that the change will be as peaceful as in Gabon. But such peaceful developments are far from being certain, given the troubled past of those two countries neighboring Gabon. The Élysée Palace African cell should therefore get ready to face sleepless nights in a very near future. That's all what I had to say about the current situation. Thank you for your attention, and please do comment my video, and even please subscribe to my channel HervéTV. It's free. If I see that I get many likes, and if I see that I get many more subscribers, I will continue making videos in English, in addition to the videos I'm doing weekly in French. Thank you very much for your attention. Good night.